In a modern glass office building in Manhattan, New York, standing 35 floors tall, Carol Bradley stood facing a large window on the top floor. It was December 23 at 3 p.m. She silently watched as the falling snow transformed the usually bustling financial district into a quiet, silvery world. Her desk was buried underneath investment analysis reports and quarterly projections, the culmination of 25 years of dedicated work in the finance industry. The walls around her displayed numerous awards, silent testimonies to her expertise as one of the most respected senior analysts at the investment bank. Will this actually work tomorrow? She muttered to herself with a deep sigh, her usually confident expression wavering. Carol ran her fingers through her salt and pepper hair, feeling the weight of her 53 years. It had been 20 years since her father's passing. During those 2 decades, Carol had immersed herself in her work, climbing the corporate ladder while simultaneously supporting her family. Her annual income of $230,000 and carefully managed savings were proof of her disciplined life and professional success. A new notification appeared on her smartphone. It was the latest Instagram post from her younger brother, Michael, showing off a new Rolex with the caption "Life is great #luxurious living #happy family #new watch." Carol frowned, the lines around her eyes deepening. Her brother, 7 years her junior, had been squandering their father's inheritance as if it would last forever. His wife, Samantha, a former model with influencer aspirations, was cut from the same cloth, posting pictures of luxury brand bags and accessories almost daily. Her mother, Eleanor, and stepfather, Howard, a former university professor, also lived beyond their means in an upscale residence in Florida, primarily supported by Carol's financial assistance. Carol had received a call from her mother the night before, as usual, about money. "Carol, listen." Her mother's voice had that familiar saccharine tone that came out whenever she wanted something. "Michael needs to cover some expenses for his business. He's just having a temporary cash flow problem." "All right, I'll transfer it again," Carol responded, resignation evident in her voice. How many temporary problems had she funded over the years? 20 years of supporting her parents' comfortable lifestyle and bailing out her brother's failed business ventures. The pattern was so predictable it had become almost comforting in its familiarity. From her desk drawer, she took out a photo, the last Christmas with her father. The picture was taken in the hospital, and though he was frail, he had a warm smile. "Dad, I'm still trying," she whispered to the photo, feeling the familiar tightness in her throat. Her gaze shifted to a reservation confirmation next to it. The high-end resort in the Pocono Mountains, Skytop Lodge. She had booked 3 suites at $800 per night for the Christmas period, totaling about $10,000. It was a significant decision, even on her income. This trip wasn't just a family vacation for Carol, it was the last chance to mend her relationship with her family after decades of strained interactions. By bearing all costs and creating time to spend with the entire family, she hoped something might finally change between them. The office phone rang. It was a confirmation call from Skytop Lodge. They wanted to make final arrangements for her stay starting tomorrow. Carol straightened up, switching to her usual professional mode. "Yes, Carol Bradley speaking regarding tomorrow's reservation." While on the phone, Carol looked out the window again. It was a winter afternoon filled with mixed feelings of anticipation and anxiety. Inside her, a quiet voice whispered that perhaps this time things would be different, though experience suggested otherwise. At Carol's apartment, in the center of Carol's apartment, a well-used but quality suitcase lay half-packed. On the bed, a dark green cashmere sweater she planned to wear the next day was neatly folded. While not extravagantly expensive, its high-quality material and simple design reflected Carol's tastes and life philosophy: quality over flashiness, substance over appearance. "Is this the right thing to wear?" she murmured, holding the dark green sweater against her chest in front of the mirror. The reflection showed a woman whose face carried the lines of experience, framed by hair that had gradually transformed from dark brown to a distinguished mixture of silver and chestnut. Samantha always wore the latest designer brands, and her mother had grown to prefer flashy clothes to match Howard's pretentious tastes. Carol wondered, not for the first time, if her simple elegance would once again make her feel like an outsider in her own family. The phone rang. It was David. "How are the preparations coming along?" His voice carried its usual kindness tinged with concern. After 2 years of dating, he'd become attuned to the subtle shifts in her mood, especially when family was involved. "Yes, mostly done," Carol replied, sounding a bit tired. "I've given the staff at Skytop Lodge special instructions. I asked them to contact me immediately if anything happens." David Morrison was a respected real estate developer and resort owner in the U.S., and Skytop Lodge was one of his luxury properties. They had met at an investors' conference 2 years ago and had been building a steady relationship since, a relationship that offered Carol a kind of understanding and support she'd never experienced within her family. "Thank you, but it'll be okay," Carol continued as she walked towards the window, watching the snow continue to fall on the city streets below. "I believe this time will be different. This trip will change something. It has to." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, but hope was a stubborn companion that refused to abandon her completely. After hanging up the phone, Carol sat down on the sofa in her living room. A photo of her last moment with her father was placed on the coffee table. It was 20 years ago, just before her father passed away in a white hospital room. Her emaciated father had gently held Carol's hand and said, "You're strong. You're the only one I can trust to take care of the family." Words that had shaped the last 2 decades of her life. With those words etched in her heart, Carol had worked relentlessly, graduated from college with excellent grades, and made her way up in the world of finance. She worked twice as hard as many of her colleagues and reached the position of senior analyst at an investment bank in her early 40s. Meanwhile, her brother, Michael, had dropped out of college following their father's death and, with the indulgence of his stepfather, continued to live off the inheritance and Carol's financial support. After his third marriage, to Samantha, they maintained a lifestyle that projected luxury on social media while masking a reality of debt and dependence. Carol's smartphone vibrated with a message from Michael, "You're picking me up tomorrow morning, right? Don't oversleep." His typically arrogant tone came through even in text. Carol briefly replied, "Of course." She had mixed feelings about using her own car for transportation. Typically, Michael used premium taxi services and hardly ever drove his own car, claiming that traffic in the city was too stressful for him. Looking at the clock, it was already past 10 p.m. She had to pick up her family early the next morning. Carol sighed deeply as she began to organize the rest of her luggage. Whether it was anticipation for tomorrow or anxiety, her heartbeat quickened slightly. Looking at her father's photo one last time, his smile seemed encouraging. "Tomorrow will surely go well," she murmured to herself as she headed to the bedroom, though the knot in her stomach suggested otherwise. The familiar blend of hope and dread would likely make for another night of fitful sleep. Christmas Eve morning. On Christmas Eve morning, Manhattan was enveloped in a silvery world of snow. The clock showed 6 a.m. Carol woke up before her alarm clock rang. "Today's the day," she said to herself as she took a deep breath and got out of bed. She had woken up 30 minutes earlier than planned, which was actually better. After 25 years in finance, punctuality was embedded in her DNA, and she wanted to be fully prepared before facing her family. In front of the large mirror in the bathroom, Carol carefully applied her makeup, taking extra time to conceal the shadows under her eyes from another night of interrupted sleep. Around her neck, she wore a single diamond necklace that was a keepsake from her father, simple, elegant, and charged with meaning. She straightened her collar and inspected her reflection once more. "As ready as I'll ever be," she whispered. The confidence she had cultivated over 53 years of life and the anxiety about the upcoming events subtly intertwined in the mirror's reflection. The underground parking garage of her well-maintained apartment building was quieter than usual. Most residents were probably still asleep on Christmas Eve morning. Carol's black Mercedes-Benz S550, a practical luxury she had allowed herself after her last promotion, gleamed under the garage lights. As she started the car, the navigation system displayed the route. The first destination was the upscale apartment on the Upper East Side where her mother and stepfather lived. From there, she would head to Michael and Samantha's new home in Brooklyn. The roads were clear, but careful driving was necessary due to the snow. When she arrived at the Upper East Side, her mother, Eleanor, was already waiting at the entrance of the apartment, dressed in a flashy red coat and holding a large Gucci bag that Carol recognized as a gift from last Christmas. Her stepfather, Howard, got into the back seat without a word, his academic demeanor a thin veneer over his perpetual displeasure. "Good morning, Carol." Her mother's voice had a contrived tone, as if greeting a high-end taxi driver rather than her daughter. "The traffic must have been terrible. We've been waiting in the cold." "I'm exactly on time, Mom," Carol replied evenly, checking her watch. "How are you both doing?" The question hung in the air, met only with Howard's grunt as he buried himself in his phone and Eleanor's dismissive wave. Next, they went to Michael and Samantha's house in Brooklyn. The couple had recently moved to an expensive area despite rumors that their financial situation was precarious, continuing to keep up appearances at all costs. "Carol, you're late." Michael's voice carried his usual arrogance as he and Samantha approached the car, their designer luggage in tow. "It's 8:05, Michael." "I said I'd be here by 8 o'clock, Carol replied, trying to keep her tone light despite the familiar irritation bubbling up. "Well, it's cold out here," Michael snapped, sliding into the passenger seat. Samantha was dressed in a new Gucci coat, holding a matching bag, her carefully made-up face set in practiced pleasantness. Both looked as if they had stepped out of a fashion magazine, though Carol knew the credit card bills behind that polished facade were likely mounting. With everyone aboard, Carol carefully took the wheel. Michael sat in the passenger seat, constantly fiddling with his smartphone, probably making another boastful post about their exclusive family getaway. The atmosphere inside the car was heavy. Apart from occasional whispers between Eleanor and Samantha, there was hardly any conversation directed at Carol. So, Carol attempted, after half an hour of strained silence, "I've heard the resort has excellent Christmas activities planned. There's a formal dinner tonight that I thought we could all attend together." We'll see," Michael replied without looking up from his phone. "Samantha and I might want to do our own thing. You know, meet some interesting people there." Carol's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I thought the point of this trip was to spend time together as a family." "Well, we are together," Eleanor interjected from the back seat. "In this car. 4 hours. Isn't that enough family time?" Howard let out a short laugh, the first sound he'd made since entering the car. Carol caught his smirk in the rearview mirror and felt something inside her sink a little further. After about 2 hours of driving, the snow-covered peaks of the Pocono Mountains came into view, breathtakingly beautiful against the clear blue sky. The sight eased some of Carol's tension, reminding her why she'd chosen this location. Perhaps the majesty of nature could inspire some genuine connection. "Ah, you can see it now," Michael suddenly exclaimed, finally looking up from his phone. The luxurious structure of Skytop Lodge appeared amidst the snowy landscape. The grand building, styled in Italian Renaissance, displayed a stunning harmony with the surrounding nature. A giant Christmas tree decorated the front entrance, and illuminations sparkled everywhere. Luxury cars arrived one after another, and wealthy families alighted, their excited voices carrying in the crisp winter air. When Carol parked the car in front of the entrance, a uniformed bellboy approached with a welcoming smile. From that moment, everything began to change. "You've worked hard to get us here," Michael's voice, icy cold, resonated inside the car. Carol twisted around to look at the back seat. There she saw her brother with a malicious smirk she had never seen before, though perhaps it had always been there, just below the surface. Her mother, Eleanor, and stepfather, Howard, averted their gazes, while Samantha gave a small, complicit smile. Carol instinctively felt that something was terribly wrong. The driver's job ends here. This hotel is for us, the real family, only, Michael declared, the pretense of familial warmth completely dropped. Carol was momentarily stunned, feeling as though the temperature inside the car had plummeted. 20 years of supporting them, of trying to hold the family together, and this was their response. What do you mean? Carol's voice trembled slightly, more from the shock of such naked cruelty than from fear. I made the reservations, she said, confusion mixing with the dawning realization of betrayal. Oh, the reservations, Michael sneered. They've already been changed, just to our names. Her mother looked troubled but said nothing, complicit in her silence. Her stepfather, Howard, continued to look out the window with studied indifference. Samantha did not bother to hide her malicious grin. Everyone except Carol got out of the car. Michael instructed the bellboy to take the luggage. Carol slowly took out her smartphone, consciously trying not to let her hands tremble, and pressed David's number. After a few rings, his calm voice came through. Hello, Carol. David, cancel the reservations. Carol's voice maintained an unexpected calm, as if the years of suppressing her emotions had prepared her for this very moment. All of them, please. After a moment of silence on the other end, David seemed to understand the situation. Understood. I'll arrange it right away. At that moment, a staff member in uniform approached from the front desk. Against the backdrop of white snow, the black uniform stood out sharply. From inside the car, Carol watched the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. I'm sorry, we cannot find your reservation, the staff member informed them. The smile vanished from Michael's face. Eleanor began fumbling through her purse in a panic. Howard turned to face the front for the first time, his academic composure cracking. There must be some mistake. Eleanor's anxious muttering was audible through the partially open window. Carol slowly rolled down the car window completely. It's no mistake, Carol's voice was calm, though her heart was racing. All reservations have been cancelled. Goodbye. The words felt both foreign and liberating on her tongue. Carol, wait. Michael's voice carried a note of desperation. It's just a joke, you know that, right? Come on, sis. But Carol had already started the engine and grasped the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, she saw her family standing perplexed in the snow. Samantha's expensive boots sank into the snow as she gesticulated angrily. Carol heard Eleanor's plaintive voice fade with the wind as the car slowly exited the hotel parking lot and began retracing its path. The snow continued to fall, creating a veil between Carol and the life she was leaving behind. A single tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another and another. They weren't tears of sorrow, though there was a deep ache in her chest. They were tears of release, of 20 years of pent-up resentment and obligation finally breaking free. It's over, she whispered to herself, her voice breaking slightly. It's finally over. Leaving the resort, her smartphone began to ring. It was Michael calling. She ignored it. Then came a call from Eleanor. Ignored as well. Messages started arriving one after another. Why would you do this? It's Christmas Eve. You've embarrassed us in front of everyone. Will you refund the accommodation costs? Carol let out a small, bitter laugh at the last message. Even now, their concern was the money, not the relationship they had destroyed, not the years of her life she had given them. 20 years, she said aloud to the empty car. 20 years of giving everything I had, and it was never enough. The reality she had been avoiding for decades finally settled around her like the falling snow, clear, cold, and undeniable. As Carol drove down the mountain, heading towards the city, she decided not to go to her own apartment but instead to David's penthouse. She felt a refreshing sense of clarity reflecting from her expression in the rearview mirror. The burden she had carried for so long, her father's dying wish, her sense of responsibility, the guilt that had been carefully cultivated by her family, seemed to be lifting with each mile that separated her from Skytop Lodge. The street lights gently illuminated the falling snow, adding a peaceful glow to the festive evening. The quietness inside the car, devoid of any passengers in the back seat, was surprisingly comforting. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, Carol felt like she could breathe freely. 2 hours later, Carol's car slid into the underground parking garage of David's building. Stepping into the elevator, she felt a warm sensation spreading inside her chest. It was clear to her that she was headed to the right place, not just physically, but in her life's journey. When she opened the door to the penthouse, she was greeted by the warmth of the space and David's concerned presence. The fireplace was already lit, softly lighting up the living room with a golden glow. "Carol, are you okay?" David asked, his voice filled with genuine care. His lined face, with salt and pepper hair similar to her own, reflected a life fully lived and a capacity for empathy that Carol found increasingly precious. "Yes," Carol smiled back, surprised to find that it wasn't a lie. "Actually, I feel relieved." David quietly listened while preparing 2 glasses of wine as Carol shared everything: Michael's malicious smile, her mother Eleanor's evasive gaze, and the actions she herself had taken. The words poured out of her, decades of suppressed feelings finally finding their voice. "Carol, you made the right choice," David assured her as they sat on the sofa in front of the fireplace. His words carried the weight of someone who understood difficult family dynamics all too well. "But I ruined their Christmas because of me," Carol muttered, gazing at the wine glass in her hand, the old guilt making one last attempt to reassert itself. "That's not true," David's voice was gentle yet firm. "They ruined their own Christmas. You just protected your own worth." Tears welled up in Carol's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. Instead, they were tears of relief from the burden she had carried for 20 years. Her smartphone vibrated again. This time it was a message from her stepfather: "Howard, because of your selfishness, you've embarrassed the entire family. Don't ever show your face again." Carol turned off her smartphone completely, feeling a strange sense of finality. David placed his hand on her shoulder, offering a warmth she had never felt from her family before. "From tomorrow, a new life begins," Carol declared, looking into the flames of the fireplace. "I won't let anyone interfere with my life anymore." David nodded silently, his presence a steady anchor in this sea of change. For Carol, this was the most meaningful Christmas Eve ever. She hadn't lost her family, she had reclaimed her true self. The keepsake necklace from her father softly glittered in the light of the fireplace, but for the first time, it felt like a connection to him rather than a chain tying her to a promise that had consumed her life. On Christmas morning, Manhattan was enveloped in a silvery white world. The view from the windows of David's penthouse looked like a postcard, with snow continuing to fall gently between the high rises, softly covering up the events of the previous day. "Good morning," David greeted her as he was already making coffee. The aroma of espresso filled the room, mixing with the scent of pine from the small Christmas tree in the corner. "I got a call from Skytop Lodge this morning," David started quietly. "Your family made quite a scene." Standing by the window with a mug clutched in her hands, Carol responded calmly, "I expected as much. Michael must have caused a commotion." Turning on her smartphone, the screen was quickly filled with notifications, over 40 missed calls, nearly 100 messages. Most were from her mother, Eleanor, and her brother, Michael, with a few from Howard. "Carol, do you think this is acceptable? You've made us a laughingstock in the lobby of a luxury hotel, and I'll never forget it. How dare you treat us this way? What about tonight? Where are we supposed to go now?" The last message was from her mother: "We need to talk about money. Call me immediately." Carol sighed deeply and set the smartphone down. David hugged her from behind, his warmth reassuring. "I've made up my mind," Carol said, ready to face whatever came next, empowered and unburdened. Carol turned to look directly into David's eyes, her resolve clear. "I'm cutting off all ties with them," she declared firmly. David nodded silently, his expression showing full support for her decision. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. "After all, they are your family." "No, they aren't," Carol replied with conviction, decades of clarity compressed into a few words. "A real family understands and supports each other. They were just strangers obsessed with money." The two moved to the breakfast table, where David had prepared croissants and scrambled eggs, a simple but heartfelt meal. This was the true happiness Carol had been seeking, not in grand gestures or expensive resorts, but in genuine connection and mutual respect. "I have a proposal for you, Carol," David said, looking earnestly at her. "Why don't we live together?" Carol was momentarily speechless. The snow quietly falling outside the window seemed to pause, suspending this moment in time. "Let's start a new life here together," David suggested, his words bringing tears to Carol's eyes, tears of joy from being freed from the false burdens of family and finding a new, true connection. "Yes," Carol smiled, "that sounds wonderful." Just then, her smartphone began to ring again. The screen displayed Mom, but Carol no longer hesitated. She picked up the phone and completely blocked her mother's number, followed by Michael's and Howard's. "I've taken a new step," Carol said with a clear and bright expression. David responded with a warm smile that reached his eyes. In that moment, Carol felt younger than she had in years, not because the lines on her face had disappeared, but because the weight on her heart had lifted, allowing her to stand straight and look forward instead of back. In mid-January, not long after the new year, Manhattan was hit by a severe cold wave. From the window of Carol's office, the cityscape seemed to shiver in the icy north wind. "Miss Bradley, there's a visitor for you in the lobby," her secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Mrs. Eleanor Brown is here." Carol's hands paused above the keyboard. Eleanor Brown. It was the first time she'd heard her mother's name since that Christmas Eve. "Understood. I'll be right there," Carol replied, her voice trembling slightly. In the high-rise building's first-floor lobby, Carol's heels echoed on the marble floor as she prepared herself for the reunion with her mother. Her mother was sitting on the visitor's sofa, not in her usual flashy attire, but in a simple gray coat, her makeup subdued, clearly showing signs of fatigue. The sight of her mother looking older and more vulnerable than she remembered momentarily softened Carol's resolve. "May I come in?" Her mother's voice lacked its former arrogance. Carol nodded silently and led her mother to the elevator. Once they arrived at the office, Carol gestured for her mother to sit on the sofa in the reception area. Outside, light snow began to dance in the air, a reminder of that fateful day at Skytop Lodge. "I came here because I needed to talk," her mother started quietly, sitting across from Carol with a cup of coffee between them. "We've reached our limit." It was exactly as Carol had expected. Her father's inheritance was nearly depleted after years of extravagant living. Her stepfather's real estate investments had failed, and they were now burdened with debt. Michael was struggling to pay for his new car and was behind on rent. "We need help," her mother's voice shook. "Mom, is this about money?" Carol asked, her tone calm. "Yes," her mother continued hesitantly, "for the monthly living expenses, Michael's car loan, and—" "Mom, that's enough," Carol cut her off, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Mom, I'm no longer the family bank. I've chosen to live my own life." Her mother's expression clouded over, a stark contrast to the clear resolve in Carol's eyes. "But we're family." Eleanor's voice rose slightly, the familiar manipulation beginning to surface. "What does real family mean, anyway?" Carol asked quietly. During Christmas, you all treated me like a chauffeur. You said nothing when Michael gave me that spiteful smile. Is that family? A heavy silence filled the room. Listen, Carol, her mother, Eleanor, said tearfully. I truly regret what happened that day, but right now, I'm really in trouble. I need your help. Carol recognized the pattern, the tears, the appeal to family ties, the carefully crafted vulnerability that had worked so many times before. Carol slowly stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the view. The building that her father once managed could be seen in the distance, a reminder of where this all began. Mom, go home, Carol said without turning around, and don't come back again. My life is mine, not a resource for you and Michael to exploit. Goodbye, Mom. Her mother seemed to want to say more but ultimately stood up in silence. The sound of the door closing echoed in the room. Carol sighed deeply as she returned to her desk and touched her father's keepsake necklace. Strangely, something heavy inside her chest felt a bit lighter. I kept my promise, Dad, she whispered. I took care of them for 20 years. But now I need to take care of myself too. Spring epilogue. The arrival of spring had transformed the Manhattan scenery. From the window of David's penthouse, now their shared home, the park was alive with blossoms in full bloom. Carol held her morning coffee and gazed at the scene. Carol, what are you thinking about? David asked gently as he joined her by the window. Just a lot of things, Carol replied, turning to smile at him. In these 3 months, my life has changed so much. Indeed, the changes were significant. She had announced her engagement to David, and she had been promoted to head of her department at the investment bank. As the leader of a new project team, her talents were fully recognized. There had been no contact from her mother, and Michael's flashy social media posts had disappeared. Later, she heard from a colleague that they had moved from a luxury apartment to a modest one, now living a simpler life. Any regrets? David asked as he stood beside her, looking at the cherry blossoms that dotted the park below. None at all. This is the path I've chosen, Carol replied, touching her father's keepsake necklace. True family isn't necessarily about blood relations, Carol thought to herself. It's about understanding and supporting each other. At 53, she had finally learned that lesson, and though it had come later in life than she might have wished, she knew that there were still many good years ahead to live by that truth. At dusk, in a fancy restaurant where she had met David 2 years ago, he had important news. We're going to expand with a new hotel chain on the West Coast, David said happily, and I want you involved as an investment advisor. Carol nodded immediately, excited by the prospect of this new chapter. Work and private life, everything was coming into perfect balance, not because circumstances were perfect, but because she had found the courage to set boundaries and prioritize her own happiness. I have a feeling this is a new beginning for our lives, Carol raised her glass, the diamond necklace catching the light. Yes, our lives, David smiled, clinking his glass with hers. The chime sounded like the beginning of a new chapter, one that Carol would write on her own terms, with the wisdom of her 53 years and the freedom of a woman who had finally learned her own worth.